So, good evening, everybody. I'm Simon Bowman. I'm the Harveyan librarian here, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. I think it's... so I hope you're in for a treat. I'm sure you're in for a treat. We've got some great speakers, and it's an absolute pleasure to be able to celebrate this great exhibition that Katie has and colleagues have put together. So really, without any ado, and I hope afterwards if you haven't already done so, you'll go around and have a look at it. But without any ado, I will invite Katie to come up and do the proper introductions.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for coming along tonight. This exhibition invites you to think about how physicians, surgeons, artists and printers have struggled with the challenges of representing the workings of our living, breathing, 3 or indeed 4-dimensional bodies on the 2-dimensional page over nearly 7 centuries. Just as the human body is infinitely varied, there's no one perfect objective way to draw or model anatomy, and every image is the product of conscious and unconscious choices and biases about what to include and what to leave out. The images in our exhibition run the gamut from apparently crude simplicity to subtle beauty, from clinical detachment to grotesque revulsion. They evoke reactions of surprise, disgust, delight, amusement, and much more. I hope that if you haven't already, you'll take some time later on to look at these images in detail and to consider your own personal reactions as well as the artistic decisions behind the finished products. The images on display use a wide range of techniques, from hand-drawn and painted, through woodblock printing, engravings, etchings in copper, lithograph, mezzotint, and more. Many of the exhibits are actually physically too large for our display cases and are shown in reproduction on the walls. The reproductions really don't do justice to the materiality of the originals and the variety of techniques used. So I've got out copies of just 2 of the books seen in reproduction out at the front here. So if you haven't had a look at them already, do come and have a look up close after the lecture because it really makes a difference to see the printing techniques in the flesh. As well as the books, prints and artworks on display, the college's anatomical tables, which are 17th century human remains dissected at the University of Padua, form an integral part of the exhibition. Though they're actual specimens of human bodies and not reproductions, they're presented as if they're illustrations on a flat page, blurring the lines between 2 and 3 dimensionality. After the lecture, please do carry on up the stairs, which are just in the corner here, to the 2nd floor, where you can see the 6 tables in all their glory on the wall. Some of the exhibits are also at their best when in movement, something that's really hard to manage in a display case. So there are some videos out on the gallery as well that bring some of the books to life, so do have a look at those as well. And also on the gallery you can hear some physicians' own thoughts about the process of learning anatomy and the revolution there's been in medical imaging in the last 50 years. And you can hear those through the audio recordings on the audio posts dotted along the gallery. Now, it takes a village to raise an exhibition, and it's my pleasure this evening to take just a few moments to thank some of the people who have made Under the Skin possible. Firstly, I'd like to thank Orla from Stagetext, who I think is on the gallery, making all of our words visible tonight. Big thanks to Orla. I'd like to thank Simon Bowman, who we've just heard from, the Harveyan librarian, Chukun Wallako, the RCP treasurer, Bob Goddard, the RCP president, and Ian Bullock, the RCP CEO, for their continuing support of the RCP Museum, Library and Archive, and also of this exhibition in particular. There are 2 anonymous individuals who have lent personal medical images to the exhibition, and I'd like to acknowledge both their generosity and their guts in putting their own bodies on show. Model-making firm Adam Rooley have lent us 2 early 20th century anatomical models, which enable us to counterpoint 2D with 3D teaching aids for the exhibition. My colleagues in the Library, Archive and Museum team have, as ever, been complete stalwarts, both hard-working and relentlessly good-humoured. Everyone in the team, and everyone says this, but I really do mean everyone in our team, has contributed to the exhibition. But I must single out our exhibitions officer, Sarah Backhouse, for her vital and unfailingly optimistic management of the whole project. And we've also had volunteers in the team over the last few months from Queen Mary University of London, their History BA course, and from various other places. And they've contributed to the research, planning and implementation of the exhibition. So thank you in particular to Alexa, Argula, Brittany and Inez. We couldn't have got it all together without the RCP design, porters and property services teams, as well as various external photographers, book conservators and art handlers who will beaver away behind the scenes to make things happen. We're delighted that Annette Wickham is here to speak tonight. Annette is the curator of works on paper at the Royal Academy and has done fabulous work on various things at the RA, including their recent display on Doctors, Death and Dining, 250 years of the anatomy professor. But before Annette speaks, I'd just like to thank Darryl Green from Magdalen College, Oxford, and Laura Moretti from the University of St Andrews, who are the co-directors of the Thinking 3D Interdisciplinary Research Project. I want to thank them for including Under the Skin in their fabulous programme of exhibitions and events this year. I'm delighted that Darryl's here this evening, and so before we hear from Annette, I'm going to invite him up to the stage just to say a few words about Thinking 3D. Thank you very much. Darryl.
Good evening and thank you. So, Thinking 3D started off several years ago as my co-director and I got on the long train from London to St Andrews after a series of meetings at the British Library and elsewhere. At the time, we were focusing on one Venetian architect who had really pioneered the way that people talked about and drew architecture, and how he'd become so successful largely because he was able to translate his concepts to the printing press. But as we chatted on that very long train ride home, we began pushing the boundaries, exploring how the techniques for communicating the world around us and the ideas inside of us had developed. What grew from that conversation is now Thinking 3D, an interdisciplinary exploration of how we, and I do mean the widest of we's, learn to put 3, or in some cases more, dimensions onto a flat surface, from geometry to astronomy, from anatomy to architecture, abstract concepts, and concrete observations. 2019 is the year that Thinking 3D has come to its apex, by design, this being the anniversary year of Leonardo da Vinci's death. Our tentpole exhibition, Thinking 3D from Leonardo to Present, opens at the Bodleian's Weston Library next month and will run for nearly a year. We have 7 other exhibitions opening across Oxford, as well as further afield, 2 symposiums, a 3-day conference, several public lectures, outreach events, and so on and so forth. It's going to be a very busy year. I'm very pleased, though, that Under the Skin is our first Thinking 3D partner exhibition of the year. Anatomy is one of the key focuses of Thinking 3D. It's a focal point for late medieval and early Renaissance medics and scientists, but also for bookmakers and for artists. You'll see in this exhibition, as well as in the anatomy section of the Bodleian exhibition and our partner exhibition at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow, the difficulties in communicating the spatial relationship between the systems that make up our body is something that perplexed authors and artists and bookmakers from the beginnings of illustrated anatomical texts. Even today, in an age where we think that computer imaging and photography supersedes the veracity of hand-drawn illustrations, we struggle with the ability to communicate effectively anatomical elements, either abstractly or in their native environment. The creativity employed by authors and artists and printers to remedy this is awe-inspiring, and it crosses disciplines for inspiration, which is right at the heart of Thinking 3D. I'd like to personally thank Katie Birkwood for her hard work as a curator, her enthusiasm for collaboration, and her cheerfulness during the whole process of exploring and putting together Under the Skin. Katie has shared much of this process with the wider world. For anybody that's on Twitter, you have known this, as well as other media, an effort which has encouraged other Thinking 3D partners to do the same. I look forward to you all seeing the fruits of her labor, if you haven't already, and to hearing this evening's speaker. But before I do, I'd like to thank Katie and her colleague Sarah Backhouse for her hard work, and her colleagues here at the RCP have a token of gratitude to present both to Katie and to Sarah. So if Katie and Sarah, if you could come up on the stage. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening. I'd like to continue the votes of thanks by thanking the college for inviting me to speak this evening, and thanking Katie Birkwood for this fantastic exhibition, which tells us so much about the importance of visual imagery in the study of anatomy, and in particular in the process of learning anatomy for medical students. But in this talk, I've called it Artists Under the Skin, so I wanted to look at some of the people who've been involved in making these images, and to remember that as well as producing anatomical imagery, artists also needed to study it themselves if they wanted to make a career depicting the human body, at least up until about the mid-20th century, that is. So I'm mostly going to be focusing on developments in Western European art in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that's mainly just because that's what I've been looking at the Royal Academy in developing a small exhibition called The Anatomy Professor, Doctor's Death and Dining, which Katie mentioned, and it's only one room, but it is free, so if you're at the Royal Academy, please do pop in and see it. But it wouldn't be practical to give a full overview of the history of dissection and collaborations between anatomists and artists tonight, and it's also something I don't feel qualified to give, but I just wanted to start with this slide just to point out that it's a much broader and longer history going back towards antiquity, and it obviously was a focus of study in many other cultures as well as in Europe. So on the left, two examples from Persia, and on the right, two from Italy, but from the Middle Ages. So I'm going to look at two specific themes in the talk, starting with the question raised by this exhibition, and that's the challenge for artists of how best to represent three-dimensionality in the human body. And secondly, by extension of that, I will also look at the question of whether those bodies should be depicted alive or dead. And both of those questions touch on the idea of who was actually directing this imagery. Was it the artists or the anatomists? And we'll come across a lot of examples where they were one and the same. So either the artist was also the anatomist, or the anatomist was also the artist. And also the question of how much anatomy artists in general needed to know, seeing it as it was a fundamental part of their training from the Renaissance onwards. So the obvious way to reproduce a 3D body is to create a 3D representation of it. And these have ranged from sculptures and wax models to plaster casts of bodies and preserved specimens. I'd say that the latter is really the preserve of the scientist, so I've kept away from those, but I'm going to look at a few of the other examples. So to start with, this shows two anatomical sculptures, one from the Renaissance period and one from the 18th century. The one on the left is from Milan Cathedral, showing Saint Bartholomew. And this is the saint who was martyred by being flayed alive. So there are lots of lovely medieval depictions of him in the process of that happening. But here he's portrayed by Marco da Grate with his skin already removed and just draped around him like a cloak, as though he's quite happy to be wearing it that way. It was produced for the cathedral, but unlike earlier depictions of Bartholomew, it seems much more interested in the reality of the flayed body than in the narrative of his martyrdom. And I just wanted to read a quick quote from Mark Twain, the author, who saw this in 1867. He said, "The figure was that of a man without skin, with every vein, artery, muscle, every fibre and tendon and tissue of the human frame represented in minute detail. It was a hideous thing, and yet there was a fascination about it somehow." And I think that sums up a lot of the images we're going to be seeing this evening. But his sculpture shows the direct influence of artists being involved at the dissecting table during this period. But it's a work of art for display in a religious context rather than an aid to learning. But the second example on the right is slightly different. This is the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon's A Famous Flayed Man, which he made as a study for a sculpture of John the Baptist. It's been described as the outstanding and most admired anatomical model in the history of sculpture and was reproduced widely. It was closely based on Houdon's extensive study of anatomy, which he carried out in Rome. And it's often described as an écorché, that is a plaster cast of a flayed body, But being pedantic, it isn't one. It's actually a sculpture. It's not made from casts. And he said himself that he had deliberately improved on nature in making this work in order to make it useful for the training of artists. He said, "In my view, the skilled surgeon must study after nature, as defective as one may find it to be, but we artists must study it differently. It is nature in all her nobility, her perfect state of health that we are looking for." So this dichotomy between the individual body and the ideal body is one that obviously crops up frequently in the history of anatomical art. As Udon pointed out, works like his were less useful for teaching anatomy to medics. The ideal for teaching medicine was, of course, to have real bodies to dissect. But these were usually in short supply during this period due to quite strict laws regarding which bodies were available for dissection. So in the UK, for instance, up until 1832, the only bodies that were legally available for dissection were those of executed criminals. So the lack of cadavers to dissect meant that alternatives were in high demand. But the alternatives had to be more accessible and, of course, cheaper than the two examples of high art we've just seen. And one answer to that problem was the preservation of specimens, and another was the production of wax models. So the latter became particularly popular in certain areas, especially Italy, during the 18th century. And they often incorporated real physical material like bones and hair, and then parts that were modelled in wax, sometimes based on casts of real bodies. So they were very much a sort of composite. This is just an example of one of these museums in Bologna in Italy, being a centre of anatomical research. And museums of wax models became very popular. They were usually set up in centres of anatomical learning, but they were also about communicating these findings to a wider public and familiarising the public with this sort of subject matter. So La Specola in Florence, which houses this what's called the Anatomical Venus, made by Clemente Susini, was opened in the late 18th century by Duke Leopold II, with a view to educating the Florentine public about empirical observation of the body. But the nature of some of these works and this sort of public status meant that they were also seen by some as being too frivolous to really be something to learn from, and more about spectacle and entertainment. One such person who had that opinion was Dr. William Hunter, so member of the College of Physicians, and you can see a reproduction of Zoffany's great portrait of him teaching at the Royal Academy, and that's currently on loan to the Hunter exhibition in New Haven at the Centre for British Art. But he, as well as being a pioneering anatomist and obstetrician, was also the first professor of anatomy at the Royal Academy from 1768 until his death. And he put as much effort into teaching artists as he did into teaching medics. And he particularly disliked the wax models we've just looked at. He criticised them for being tawdry, incorrect, and ridiculous. He certainly made use of corpses from dubious sources in his own anatomy theatre, but at the Royal Academy he seemed to have tended to stay on the right side of the law, and he only dissected the corpses of executed criminals that were given to him. However, they were in fairly short supply for the use of art students, so he wanted to make the most of the bodies that he got, and he developed the practice of creating these écorché plaster cast figures from flayed corpses. He described this practice as veridical representation, meaning that they were made from real bodies, so they weren't artificial in the way that the wax models could be sometimes. And this is an example of one of them, made in 1771. And the occasion was actually recorded by one of the students at the RA at the time, the painter James Northcote. He wrote to his brother, "I suppose you've seen accounts upon the newspapers of the Jews which were hung for robbing a house and murdering a servant man in it. We had the body of one of them at the Academy for Dr. Hunter to read his lectures on. We had 2 lectures on it because they might have the body fresh to cast a plaster anatomical figure from it." One of the fascinating things about the three figures we have of écorchés at the Academy, or two that were made by Hunter at least, is that we've actually been able to look at the surviving documentation and find out who they were. So the case that Northcote referred to was quite notorious because all of the gang were Jewish, and so it made a sort of big splash in the newspapers and a huge fuss was made over it. But it meant that all of them are named and we actually know who they were. So a researcher at Glasgow University has recently been able to verify that the écorché here was made from a man called Solomon Hunter. You might look at this figure and wonder where his arm is. I can't tell you. You might also wonder where his genitals are. But the researcher at the University of Glasgow has actually found them. They're in a jar in Hunter's collection. So we know a lot about these figures. He made another of these in 1776, and this is a copy made in 1834. But yet again, the occasion was actually documented and described by one of the students, who said, "I've seen two men hanged, and one with his breast cut open at Surgeons' Hall. The other being a fine subject, they took him to the Royal Academy, covered him with plaster of Paris, and after they had put him in the position of the dying gladiator." So this is quite significant because this wasn't just Hunter working on his own. He was working with the sculptor Agostino Carlini, and it was Agostino Carlini who chose this classicizing pose, which is almost exactly copying the dying gladiator or the dying Gaul. And scholars have linked this and also the sort of less visceral appearance of the figure. I mean, you can see the other one has got one side of it which is quite deeply dissected and the other isn't. But this is more of a surface dissection just down to the muscles. This has been linked to attempts to validate anatomical study for artists by connecting it with classical sculpture and investing this quite gruesome figure with greater elegance and propriety. And yet again, there's been a lot of discussion about identifying the person whose body this was made from. And we're down to a pair of smugglers called Benjamin Harley or Thomas Henman, who murdered a revenue officer, but hence the mock Latin nickname it was given at the Royal Academy almost straight away of Smuglerius, so it's a nice bit of gallows humour. But this one's also notable. It was made for the Royal Academy, but after Hunter's time, but it really shows his influence carrying on. Some of the people at the Academy and in the art world in general felt that Hunter actually promoted too much in the way of anatomical study for artists. But this one shows an example of artists learning from the body, not just for the sake of it, but for a very specific purpose. They'd been having a debate about how a crucified body would actually look, and how in most depictions by the old masters, the bodies either look too dead or too alive. And so what they did with this poor man was to take his body from the gallows while it was still warm and have it attached to a crucifix and let it cool off and rigor mortis to set in while he was on there before they flayed it and then cast it. And they had a before and after, but sadly the before is lost. We don't know where that's gone, but we still have the flayed version. It was made by the surgeon Joseph Constantine Carpew with the sculptor Thomas Banks, but it was at the request of two other academicians, Benjamin West and Richard Cosway, who'd been having this debate. And again, we know the identity. This man was called James Legg. He was a Chelsea pensioner who shot one of his fellow pensioners. He asked him for a duel, and the other man refused, so he shot him and was sent to the gallows. But it's quite interesting looking at the newspaper reports on the case, because they describe him as being very venerable and over 70, and reading between the lines and his defense of insanity, it looks like he probably actually had dementia, but that wasn't accepted by the court. Yet despite replicating the appearance of the body very closely, there are clear disadvantages to items like these, whether for the use of artists or doctors. Their size, of course, means that they're not very easy to move around. They're quite fragile. They're made out of plaster, so bits fall off. They're not transparent, so you can't see anything below a certain level of dissection. So sculpture models and écorchés were therefore of most use within an educational institution or a museum collection. Much more accessible in terms of expense, portability, and the dissemination of knowledge were, of course, two-dimensional representations of the body in prints, drawings, and book illustrations, as we see in the exhibition here. And artists, of course, habitually dealt with the idea of how to represent three-dimensionality in two-dimensional form. But the study of anatomy, of course, represents further challenges to that, as their work needs to clearly communicate multiple structures and layers within a three-dimensional body, and they approach this in various different ways. So Darryl already mentioned the anniversary of Leonardo, so I thought no better place to start than by looking at his fantastic drawings. The art historian Kenneth Clark described him as the most relentlessly curious person in history, and that's very much borne out by looking at his anatomical drawings. There are about 600 of them altogether, mostly in the Royal Collection at Windsor. So Leonardo intended to publish this work, but it never came to fruition. And so although he did all of this and apparently made medical discoveries even about how many chambers there are in the heart, this basically went unknown for centuries, and they weren't published properly until the 19th century. William Hunter, in fact, was one of the first people to see the drawings in the Royal Library and to study them. But Leonardo claimed to have dissected over 30 bodies himself, and he described his drawings as a better tool for learning anatomy than dissection, because they dispense with the messy reality of a dead body and distill the important information into images that communicate how the various structures work. So his drawings therefore not just record, but they synthesize the knowledge he's acquired through observing and conducting numerous dissections. And in doing so, he developed various specific approaches to communicating anatomical structures, which are not simply a record of what he saw. So in the drawing on the left, for instance, if you look at the top right here, this is what's known as the thread model, where he's reduced the muscles to these sort of threads in a very schematic way in order to understand them better and to demonstrate how they work. And he's done something very similar here. Apparently there are several vertebrae too many, but he's reduced the muscles to these sort of strings, and this has been compared to a drawing of the rigging on a ship. And similarly, in both of these drawings, he's used different strategies to represent the body. So in both of them, he's depicted the outline of the figure, but it's basically transparent so that you can see through to the various systems beneath, and to make it more understandable. In his notebooks, he writes a sort of defense almost of his interest in anatomy, which seems strange. They're such amazing drawings. I don't know why he felt the need to do that, but he said, "You who say it's better to see an anatomist at work than to see these drawings would be right. If it were possible to see a single figure in all of the drawings, see in a single figure all of the things that the drawings show." And he also points out that someone might be interested in anatomy, but they might not have the stomach for it or the temperament, and may find themselves, he says, in fear of spending the night in the company of bodies quartered and skinned and unpleasant to see. And then he adds, "If this does not prevent you, perhaps you will have no gift for drawing, or knowledge of the order of geometric demonstration, or in calculating the forces and power of the muscles, or perhaps you'll be lacking patience." I think that's something we can all identify with. But Leonardo's intense engagement with anatomical study had an effect, of course, on the training of artists at the time, but because his drawings were never reproduced and published, they had little wider impact at that stage. And it was really through published illustrated books that anatomical knowledge was disseminated, and through which particular types of anatomical imagery developed. And this, of course, usually required a collaboration between artist and anatomist, a relationship that was not always straightforward, as we'll see from some of the examples. It's summed up by Samuel Thomas von Sommering in 1791, who expressed his difficulty in finding what he called a drawer, who on the one hand is capable of understanding everything that a dissector actually needs to know, and on the other hand is not too stubborn to follow a lead. And he complains that some artists get interested in insignificant details. He calls this a meticulousness that does harm to the important points. But on the other hand, of course, you can't please everyone. Some commentators dislike the fact that depictions were too much like artworks in their own right, and you can see that in a sense here from the backgrounds that have been added. So although there were plenty of earlier manuscripts and some published books, a key early publication in anatomical imagery is Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libri Septem, so the fabric of the human body in 7 books, which was illustrated with this series of highly accomplished woodcuts. So that's a relief printing process whereby the wood is cut away from the block to be printed, leaving the lines in relief. Vesalius was from Brussels, but spent a lot of his work in Italy at the University of Padua. And this book was published in 1543, largely based on his knowledge of dissection. And the story goes that he had plenty of bodies to dissect because he made friends with a local judge and he passed him all of the bodies. But the Fabrica really emphasizes this importance of dissection and what's been called the anatomical view of the body. So it's very much in contrast to those earlier depictions which are more diagrammatic and involve kind of elements of things like astrology and other theories. This is much more straightforwardly about what can be found within the body. But a lot of the book's impact has to be explained by its high production values and artistry. There are over 200 illustrations, some of which feature these full figures in various kind of classical poses in various levels of dissection. Sadly, the artist isn't recorded, and it's likely that there was more than one artist involved. But one suggestion of the person behind it is Jan Steven van Kalkar, who was a pupil of Titian. So again, there's a direct link with people producing high art. The plates are called the muscle men because of how they depict the different layers of muscles. And they're some of the most famous medical illustrations in the history of the printed book. The first 6 frontal views and the first 6 back views can be placed together if you were to dismember the book, which obviously isn't a good idea, but it's been noted that if you put images of all of them together like this, there's a kind of continuous background going on, and apparently these are the hills around Padua in Italy. So they're interested in the reality of the body, but also the reality of life in this area. At the same time, or more or less, Vesalius also published another version of this work called The Epitome. And for the Fabrica, he said that specifically he hoped the book would be useful for artists, for painters and sculptors, as well as for physicians and a more general public. And that seems to have been one of the reasons that he published this abridged version with a much greater emphasis on the illustrations. And it also includes this amazing example of an early pop-up book. And you can see there's somebody just lifting the different layers there, and that's a close-up of it. It's really beautiful. But of course, that's really a collector's item, and that sort of thing couldn't be mass-produced until much later. So another milestone in anatomical illustration was Bernard Siegfried Albinus's Tabulae Skeletti et Musculorum Corporis Humani, so the tables of the skeleton and muscles of the human body, or otherwise known as the tables. And again, he was publishing anatomy for medics, but it's clear from the style of the images also for a much more general audience. So the background information has been ramped up a little bit here, even more than Vesalius. He worked very closely with the artist Jan van der Laar, and the figures in this book are very classical in the way that they're posed. So it's almost like a sort of Apollo Belvedere figure. And there's all of this interest in the background, including a rhino called Clara, which they put in to hopefully sell more copies because she was famous. Unlike Vesalius, the plates are engravings rather than woodcuts, so that really just means that there's potential for greater accuracy, and it's more durable, so more prints can be made. In an attempt to increase the scientific accuracy of anatomical illustration, Albinus and van der Laar devised a new technique where they placed nets with square webbing at particular intervals between the artist and the specimen, and they copied then using grids so that they got the proportions exactly right. And Albinus certainly saw himself as the director of the whole project, although the two were very close, and van der Laar even lived in Albinus's house for a while. But he said, I was constantly with him to direct him how everything was to be done, assisting him in the drawing and correcting what was drawn, and thus he was instructed, directed, and as entirely ruled by me as if he was a tool in my hands. The tables were criticised, in fact, by other scholars, particularly for these elaborate backgrounds, because they thought that was taking the emphasis away from the body. But Albinus actually staunchly defended van der Laar, who had devised these. So I'm just then going to show a few quick examples to show some works where both artist and anatomist have had a particular interest in the technique to reproduce certain aspects of the work. So this is William Cheselden's osteographia, a comprehensive study of the bones. And he described himself, again, as the artistic director of this project. And he hired two artists, Gerard van der Gucht and Jacob Scheinvoet. I hope I've got that right, I'm not a Dutch speaker. They were both the draftsmen and the engravers on the project. And Cheselden wanted an illustration of every bone in the human body, as he put it, delineated as large as life. And so to this end, he had the artists use a camera obscura, which you can see them using here, this contraption, to make sure that they could get the exact size of the bones right. And we have drawings of these in the Royal Academy collection. This is one which is quite finished, but there are some which are at a very early stage, and you can see how the artists were using the camera obscura to trace the outline of the bones. But they then had to use their own eyes and artistry in order to reproduce the texture. But you can see in all of the drawings, there's a real interest in getting this texture right and in doing that in a linear way so that it could be easily translated into illustrations using engraving. Cheselden wrote, "Where particular parts needed to be more distinctly expressed on account of the anatomy, there I always directed. The expressing the smoothness of the ends of the bones by engraving only with single lines, while other parts were all etched, was also my contriving." So they're, trying different approaches to the drawings and printmakings to achieve their ends. And the 18th and 19th centuries saw great diversification of print techniques, with processes like mezzotint and aquatint, which were aimed at reproducing tonal qualities, while lithography and wood engraving particularly lent themselves to book illustration. And these all had an effect on the production of an anatomical imagery. But one thing, of course, people wanted to introduce was colour to bring in that sort of element of realism. And essentially, for most of the period, the easy way to do that was hand colouring, but that, although straightforward, had the disadvantage of great variability. So people were experimenting with various different methods, and I just wanted to show the example of this work, which is in the exhibition, by the Gautier-Dagoty family, who came up with various ways of using mezzotint. They would use 4 different plates with different colours, red, yellow, blue and black, to create this colour image with great sort of texture. It has quite an unsettling effect, it has to be said. One of the family observed, "For men to be instructed, they must be seduced by aesthetics, but how can anyone render the image of death agreeable?" And I have to say, I'm not sure he was particularly successful here, but it's a very striking image. And that's just an example of a mezzotint. That's what it was normally used for. So it's very tonal, moving from dark to light. But it's also a very time-consuming process, so it didn't really work terribly well for anatomical illustrations. These are Lizar's hand-coloured etchings, which give much more precise and intricate results. And this was a collaboration between 2 brothers, the Scottish artist William Home Lizars and his brother, who was the anatomist. And this is just to show you some lithographs. So in lithography, which was invented in 1796 and developed through the 19th century, then became very important in book illustration, but it's a flat printed image that transfers from a limestone block and works on the premise that water and grease repel. So the image is applied to a stone in a greasy medium to which the ink sticks, and that proved to be an important thing for book publishing. But these are some examples from Joseph Maclise's Surgical Anatomy. His brother was the painter Daniel Maclise, so he could have got him to produce his artwork, but he did his own illustrations. And it's been observed that the faces in his works are like a gallery of portraits. And he himself states in the preface to his book that he believed in leaving the body as whole as possible in order to help orient the surgeon and foster the impression of lingering life. So we'll come back to that in a second, but they're interesting examples. So, as I said earlier, improvements in commercial publishing allowed for mass production of items like pop-up books for a more general audience. But at the same time, ironically, those developments actually led back to more diagrammatic illustrations in books intended for the medical profession, like Gray's Anatomy. So it's a delicate balance there. So for the last 10 minutes or so, I just wanted to extend the theme of 2D and 3D to look at whether bodies were depicted alive or dead, and how much anatomy is about the living or how much is about the dead. So going back to Leonardo, his anatomical drawings are so vividly portrayed, they're like reanimated corpses, and they're very well removed, as he said in his own notes, from the actual process of dissecting. And it's quite interesting to look at Vesalius, because there's already a sort of disconnect here between this very lively figure cavorting around the Paduan countryside and then this fellow who's hanging from the gibbet. And then taking it a stage further, you've got fragments of the body carved up on the slab. So there's a bit of everything there. But generally speaking, many anatomical books produced in Europe from the Renaissance onwards favoured this approach of the anatomized yet animated figure as though they're fully alive. These are from a book by the artist, illustrated by the artist Odoardo Fialetti, who'd been a student of Titian, so again, that connection. But increasingly, there was a growing interest in giving some indication of the realities of dissection, and that comes through in numerous illustrations and drawings in the 18th and 19th century. An artist's experience of studying anatomy as part of their training during the period also tended to have quite an effect on other work that they produced. So I just wanted to show you this example. I mentioned William Hunter before. This is a detail of one of the illustrations from his book, The Anatomy of the Human Gravid Uterus, which had illustrations by the Dutch artist Jan van Riemsdyk. And he worked very closely with Hunter over 10 years to produce really strikingly lifelike drawings that were then engraved and published in the book. Although they worked together, Hunter didn't particularly credit Riemsdyk as much as he might have done. But it was certainly a joint project. I think the illustrations are, really a big part of the reason why it was so successful. They very much present the body as dead and often truncated in ways that we now find quite alarming. And there are other hints at the reality of the process, such as the depiction of a fly on the body. But I particularly like this one, partly because it's not as gruesome as some of the others, but he's got the reflection there of a 9-paned window in the dissection room, and that's reflecting off the membrane that the fetus is still within. So it's a really striking little detail that's telling you that the artist was actually, there in the room. Another publication that very clearly situates the bodies as cadavers on the slab is John Bell's engravings illustrating the anatomy of the bones, muscles, and joints. Bell in particular criticized what he called the subjugation of true anatomical drawing to the capricious interference of the artist, whose rule it has too often been to make all beautiful and smooth, leaving no harshness. Well, he certainly corrected that. If you have a look through the book, they're really, really ghoulish, but quite amazing images as well. So instead of hiring an artist, he did his own works. And, these are really the antithesis to the depictions that Van der Laar produced for Albinus. And so instead of anatomist as artist, this is just an example of the artist as anatomist again. These are some more drawings from the Royal Academy collection by the painter Benjamin Robert Hayden. And he was a friend of Bell's brother Charles, and he became a devotee of dissection as well. And what's interesting about the drawings is that you can trace his progression from just studying books to studying specimens to attending and then supervising dissections. So that's one that he drew from a specimen. That's obviously in the mortuary. And he goes back to this one and writes notes about it, saying how he got it wrong before he saw a body. He kept all of these drawings together, and he used them to teach his own students. So his curriculum was deliberately set up in opposition to the RA, which he felt had kind of backtracked on its commitment to the discipline after the death of William Hunter. And this is one by one of his students, Edwin Landseer. And he again seems to have got quite caught up in the idea of being, in the dissection room. Hayden proudly declared that his students were hanging over a putrid carcass, dissecting and drawing for 12 to 15 hours a day at a time of year when surgeons generally give it up. So he was quite into that. But I just wanted to say that, of course, the classical tradition still persisted, and in particular a trend for artists actually learning anatomy through classical sculpture. So here you've got the Borghese gladiator anatomized, as it were. And these plates are color-coded, so again, using different strategies to give information about the body. So the contour of the body in the skeleton plates is usually given in red ink, and then there's a broken line for detached muscles, and then a different color for deeper dissection. This isn't hugely relevant here, but I just wanted to show these drawings again from the RA collection, because Stubbs conducted a fairly grueling and grisly process of dissecting multiple horses over a year and a half to produce his book, The Anatomy of the Horse. But that was because he wanted to depict the horses as though alive, and he constructed a sort of pulley system in order to support their bodies in this position in order to draw them. But the results were very much depicting living horses like the amazing Whistle Jacket. So I just wanted to bring this to an end by looking at a few images that also suggest the effects of studying anatomy on artists outside the realm of illustration. So following the innovations of Hunter at the Royal Academy, there was a sort of noticeable fashion for depicting highly muscular bodies that almost look like écorchés. So these are two by Johann Henry Fuseli. So that's, again, a sort of classical figure, anatomized, and the figures in his paintings also have this sort of appearance. This is by Sir Thomas Lawrence, and he was painting this way to show that he could address a grand history painting, but it wasn't particularly appreciated. This heroic style was dismissed as looking like a mad German baker dancing naked in a conflagration of his own treacle. You can come see that at the RA as well. And I just threw in William Blake because he wanted to learn from imagination and draw from imagination, not from nature, but you still see this sort of fashion for anatomized bodies cropping up in his work too. Theodore Géricault, when he was painting the raft of the Medusa, that involved multiple trips to the morgue to paint parts of dead bodies. And I've just thrown in Turner there. It's called The Fall of Anarchy. It's a much more imaginative approach, but tapping into the interest in apocalyptic imagery at the time. He wasn't known, of course, for his figure painting, but he did attend lectures on anatomy at the Academy, and there are notes in his sketchbooks at the Tate about that. So anatomy was dropped from the curriculum of art schools from the 1960s onwards. Of course, some people still work as medical illustrators, but often those books can be illustrated by previous illustrations and also by photographic techniques now, so it's a different dynamic. From the 1960s onwards, as I was saying, the study of anatomy in art schools kind of drops off altogether, but there's still a professor of anatomy at the Royal Academy, and the new one is called Roger Kneebone, so he was obviously made for the job. And the Ruskin School of Art in Oxford still runs a course which has compulsory anatomy module. And I just wanted to point out that, anatomical imagery nevertheless stays very sort of resonant and crops up very frequently in contemporary art in quite a bombastic way by Damien Hirst. I particularly like this one to show the scale, otherwise it looks a bit like something you can buy from eBay for about 80 quid. And in a quieter way, but also very interesting involvement in anatomical art and in medical institutions is Christine Borland. Oops. Oh, well, I think I've lost my last slide, unfortunately. But it was just to point out the work of both Sarah Simblett and Eleanor Crook, who are both involved with the Ruskin, and they actually still go to dissections and draw from dead bodies, and they take their students to them as well. And I was going to show you a little écorché figure by Eleanor, mainly because its title is Gaze Too Long into the Abyss, and the abyss gazes also into you. So on that note, I'll leave it. Thank you.
Well, continuing the theme of thanks, I'd like to thank Annette for that absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you so much for drawing in many of the exhibits that we have in the exhibition, as well as bringing in fabulous examples, especially from the RA collection. We're going to open up the floor to questions, so if anyone has a question, please put your hand up. Please, I ask that you wait until a microphone like this arrives at you before you ask your question. That means everyone in the room gets to hear the question as well as Annette's answer. And if anyone wants to quiz me as curator of the exhibition, I will hover as well, and we'll see what we can do between us. So, the floor is open.
Hi, how is 3D printing, if at all, coming into this side of things?
So 3D printing is definitely something that's spreading into the medical world, and there's lots of really exciting research happening at the moment looking at the ways that 3D printed things can be used both as part of surgical implants, things inserted into the body, but also as part of training and preparation work for physicians and surgeons. So there's a really interesting project going on at the moment, both the name of which and the name of participants of which I cannot currently remember, which is very poor. But what they've been doing is printing 3D hearts, 3D models of real people's hearts based on MRI scans of the body that they're then using as part of the preparation for surgical intervention on the hearts, and we were really hoping to have one of their models in the exhibition, and the logistics of it hasn't quite worked out, so it's not in, but it may yet appear, or we may include it in something in the future. And there was a big splash about them on the net recently, but like I say, if you look for 3D printed hearts surgery preparation, that will probably turn it up, because it's a really interesting thing. They make these sort of white model hearts, and you can still see the contours where the slicing of the MRI at different layers is there, but it's effectively a model of someone's real living heart. Thanks. Do we have any other? Yeah, there's one here.
So you mentioned
one at the back and then one at the front. Yeah.
No, you mentioned that some of the exhibits were 2D, some were 3D, and some were 4D. Sorry, it's very loud, this microphone. Could you elaborate on what the 4D images might be?
Okay, so we don't have 4D images. I don't know what a 4D image, I mean, it's supposed to be a 3D thing moving through time, but we have some representations of four-dimensionality in the form of tracings of the heart. So when you see a heart monitor bleeping away, that's something that has a much longer history in a 19th century invention called the sphygmograph, which would measure your pulse with a gadget that sits on the wrist. And that, it looks like a very simple thing, the shape, just sort of a wiggly line on the screen, but that's actually a representation of the four-dimensionality of the heart, because it's the moving of this three-dimensional thing over time. So that's my conceptual approach to four-dimensionality in the exhibition. Okay, there was a question here.
Yes, hi. I just noticed there weren't that many images of women, and so I was wondering, when the books started being mass-produced, were female anatomy, was it featured in them?
Well, I was just going to say that I left some out deliberately because they're a bit horrible and some people object to them, and there's a lot of kind of discourse about whether they're sort of violent in their essence. So Hunter, for instance, published this book on the uterus at all stages of pregnancy, but people tend to find it a little bit disturbing, so I just use the detail. But there are books, but I'll leave Katie to say a bit more.
Yeah, this is an issue I thought about a lot as I was working on the exhibition, and now once it's in as well, and I sort of see it all out there. I also made the deliberate decision not to include a copy of Hunter's on the anatomy of the human gravid uterus. The illustrations are spectacular, and they are undoubtedly a fabulous illustration of what the exhibition's looking at, the way artists approach three-dimensionality, but they are also some of the most violent, to my mind, of anatomical images in the way they represent the human body. And they get quite a lot of airtime. They've been displayed recently in Glasgow, which I know isn't very local to London, alongside the plaster casts that Hunter made of these same bodies. And I didn't feel I had a good enough reason to include them in the exhibition, given the way they present the female body. There's a wider issue about female bodies in anatomical illustration, which ties into the issue of the way anatomical illustration presents a norm. So the body you see in a picture of anatomy is usually male. It's almost always young. It's certainly healthy. It's not disabled. It has all its limbs. And it's usually male. It's being male fits into that because the male is considered the archetype and the female is considered a diversion from that. There's also a practical reason for it, which is that I think male corpses were much easier to come by, especially in a world where most of the corpses that are being obtained are criminals. There are far higher rates of execution of men than there are of women, not least because when a woman is sentenced to death, in many countries she could plead her belly. She could be, if she were pregnant, she wouldn't be executed, and women did certainly use that as a way of getting out of the gallows by claiming they were pregnant because you wouldn't take the risk. So there are at least two different things which both tie into long-term systematic oppression of women. Into that, there's the fact that bodies aren't available, and there's the fact that they're not considered the norm. And there's the fact that the people doing the dissecting are mostly men, and they're just not as interested, I think, in women's bodies until they start to think about the fact they can make money from them. So people like William Hunter, who made a lot of his money as an obstetrician, delivering the babies of the rich and famous, and then female anatomy is suddenly very important because it's what's earning him his crust, which is quite a cynical view, but I think it definitely has a role to play, and it's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, there's another one just here.
Thank you, and thank you for your talk. I was struck throughout the presentation about the, I guess to the comments you were just making about the exploitative nature of obtaining many of these bodies and producing the drawings and models that we see today. Were there any cultures or places in the world where that wasn't the case that you found through your research?
That's a good question. I think it's always a bit of an issue, a controversial issue, carving up people's bodies, but do you know of any?
I'm actually going to admit that my knowledge of this isn't up to the task, and I'm not going to pronounce on cultures that I'm not expert in, and I don't know. I'm pretty certain that there are places in the world that have had greater injunctions against dissecting bodies than, say, Western Europe since around 1500. But I'm not going to give examples because I'm really not qualified to speak on it. And again, there is a huge cultural bias in this exhibition, which is born of the fact it's a collection that was connected by white men in Europe. So, yeah.
That goes for the Royal Academy as well.
I think we have time for probably one more question. So there's one here.
Thanks. I was just, in my mind, I imagined the Royal Academy would just be full of academicians' work. And I was fascinated at the huge range of artists from all over the world that are in the collection. And I was just wondering about the policy of purchasing. Why and how did they purchase such a wide range of images?
That's a very good question. It's quite a difficult collection to explain, but I should say not all of the images were from the RA, but it brings together a library which was for artists and students. So, that was for bringing together source material, lots of illustrated books, so things like Vesalius and Albinus. But most of the paintings and sculpture we have or most of the paintings are by academicians. They were donated, so each academician has to give what's known as a diploma work, so a representative example of their work. Then we have things like plaster casts, which are there for teaching purposes, and the works on paper collection is much broader, mainly because a lot of it came in through bequest and gift. So there's usually some connection with either the academy, schools, or British art of that period. But yes, it is. I mean, it's wonderfully broad, which is a good thing, I think.
Okay, great. I think that's probably a great note on which to end, unless anyone has a burning question. No? Okay, well, thank you all again for coming, and huge thanks to Annette for a wonderful talk, and I do hope you'll stay to enjoy the exhibition a bit further, and the bar continues downstairs. Thank you very much.